Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Reading Kant, the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, Part 7, the exciting wrap-up of all the things that Kant's been arguing here. And continuing on from where we were, and I mentioned that he was arguing against the two major schools of thought, the empiricists and the idealists, that had framed the philosophical discourse of the natural science in his age. Of course, also metaphysical principles, which predate that, and all at the same time. So he's basically fighting with everybody on all fronts at all times. So he's really going for it. And just in case you thought I might be lying to you or misleading you, I introduce you to the section that we left off with last time, which is 49. And 49 is simply an assault on a couple of things, but most importantly, Cartesian idea, which I'm sure you've heard the "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum," and that foundation of idealist philosophy. And he says, hey, here's the problem with that. He says, and this is about halfway through section 49. And he says, since, however, in the I in the proposition I am does not signify merely the object of inner intuition in time, but also the subject of consciousness, just as a body does not signify merely outer intuition in space, but also the thing in itself that underlies this appearance, accordingly, the question of whether bodies as appearances of outer senses exist outside my thought as bodies in nature can without hesitation be answered negatively, right? So he's repeating the same point he's made several times, which is like, look, all we get are appearances, and we really don't get a lot of connection with the things themselves. And so, yeah, we can say that's wrong already. But here matter does not stand otherwise for the question of whether I myself, as an appearance of inner sense, right? If the I is an appearance of my inner sense, the soul, according to empirical psychology, exists in time outside my power of representation. For this question must also be answered negatively. So congratulations, you don't exist. So God, again, he just does this over and over. He gives these crushingly logical arguments against just the most fundamental assumptions in this kind of offhand way. So, by the way, if you thought the notion that you can articulate I suggests that there is such a thing that I actually exist, well, obviously, if you think about it for just a second, you realize this is a silly proposition. This is nothing but a necessity for the capacity to think something that might be an I, and has no merit towards the fact that you may or may not exist. So don't get carried away with thinking, I think, therefore I am, tells you anything, because the I there is very, very dubious indeed. And then he just says, formal idealism, elsewhere called transcendental idealism, actually destroys material or Cartesian idealisms. For space is nothing but a form of sensibility, then it is, as representation in me, just as real as I am myself, and the only question remaining, the empirical truth of the appearance in this space. If this is not the case, but rather space and the appearances in it are something existing outside us, then all criteria of experience can never, outside of perception, prove the reality of these objects outside of us. So, there you go. So, congratulations. Your existence is very dubious, and in any case, the I think, therefore I am does absolutely nothing for you, because the fact that you have an I that thinks does not prove existence. It proves sort of perception of something, and what that is, we don't know, but probably mostly it's a perception of our perceiving apparatus. As I said, he keeps coming back to this sort of meta point. So maybe all we really know is that there's some perceiving apparatus that makes us think things like there is an I. But that doesn't mean there is one. It just means that it's a byproduct of how we perceive the world, not of the world itself, including our potential existence within the world. Oh, by the way, it doesn't preclude that we exist. So that's pretty positive. So we might exist, but we might not exist. So like I said, Kant is like, he's just skepticism turned up to 11. He's so great. But that's definitely a sideline. So back to his core argument, which is about, he calls these cosmological ideas and principles. And we get another chart, but this one is actually kind of helpful and fascinating. And he calls these cosmological ideas, and there's 50 and 51 here in the chart that follows. But if we look at this, he says, in the first place, the usefulness of a system of categories is here revealed so clearly and unmistakably that even if there were no further grounds of proof of that system, this alone would sufficiently establish their indispensability in the system of pure reason. So he says there are four necessary transcendent ideas, right, from pure reason. So great, pure reason. Now we're getting there. We're getting to the firm grounds of metaphysics. We've got pure reason. What are those four ideas that we have to have? The world has, as to time and space, a beginning. Great. Well, the antithesis of that is the world is, as to time and space, infinite. And then he repeats this 4 times, right? So that's one. And he says, everything in the world is constituted out of the simple, which is to say it's unitary. There is nothing simple, but everything is composite. Well, everything is made up of other things, right? So this is the old atomist problem from ancient Greeks that continues on until today. Is there a place at which you reach where everything is unitary because there's just a force or a field or something? Or does it quarks to gluons to Lucky Charms to, something else, right? Is it infinitely divisible, or is it all of a piece? Thesis, there exists in the world causes through freedom. Antithesis, there is no freedom, but everything is nature. Free will and debate, right? Everything is caused by natural laws and is the rational expression of those, or there's actually freedom. Thesis, in the series of causes in the world, there is a necessary being. Antithesis, there is nothing necessary in this series, but in it everything is contingent. So is it all random, or is it have meaning? And so he just says, here is the strangest phenomenon of human reason, no other example of which can be pointed out in any other its uses. If, as normally happens, we think of appearances of the sensible world as things in themselves, if we take the principle of their connection to be principles that are universally valid for things in themselves and not merely for experiences, then an unexpected conflict comes to light which can never be settled in the usual dogmatic manner, since both thesis and antithesis can be established through equally evident, clear, and incontestable proofs. So, what do we do when pure reason, which, a critique of pure reason, this is the book on which this is being extracted, leads us to, and there's no mistakes in the reasoning. This is the thing he's saying. It's like pure reason left to its own devices will tell you these series of antithetical cases, right? So, wow, that means that pure reason is unreliable. And so even the grounds that he's sort of been holding out to us, like, we're going to get to this place of a priori analytic propositions that allow us to build this metaphysical world, you can see that the synthetics are problematic, but you can use empiricism to back them up. You have concepts that can stretch across and connect synthetic experiences and derive larger laws that exist in the mind or exist as categories, right? So you're like, hey, we're making progress. We're getting ahead. And now he just says, look, if you just have pure reason, then you can conclude these two totally and complete, you can create these antithetical statements perfectly. And since these antithetical statements cannot be possibly simultaneously true under this understanding of reason, then we've got problems, right? Now you realize we can't even rely on pure reason to help us out. So notice, empiricism is not that helpful. Experience is obviously problematic. Metaphysics, he's kind of cut us off where God can't help us out too much. And now even reason is kind of getting shunted aside. And so how does he square this circle, which is actually an example that he uses himself? But notice this. He says, if we take the principles of their connection to be principles that are universally valid for things in themselves and not merely for experience, then an unexpected conflict comes to light. The way you solve these conflicts is by assuming that none of this stuff actually exists in the actual world, like outside of our experience and perception and the categories that we think. Now, this case is here, this is section 52b. Now, this case is here actual and indeed is so with respect to our four natural ideas of reason from which there arise, each with proper consistency and from the universally acknowledged principle, four assertions on one side and just as many assertions on the other, thereby revealing the dialectical illusion of pure reason in the use of principles, which otherwise would have remained hidden. We're doomed, right? Like I said, you can't use this. Like we now see that dialectical reason does not lead us to truth, it leads us to inconsistency. The logical mark of the impossibility of concepts consists then in this, that under the presuppositions of this concept, two contradictory propositions would be false simultaneously. And since between these two, no third proposition can be thought, through this concept, nothing at all is thought. So, not only is he saying you can't trust reason, but when you try to follow dialectical reason in this fashion, and you produce these two contradictory terms, you're not even thinking anymore, right? You've stopped even. This is not thought, right? This is just delusion. This isn't right. You're not reasoning functionally. You're just self-deluding, and so, I mean, he just brutalizes us with this, and so he wants to move away from idealist reasoning. Absolutely, he's like totally opposed to this. But having just spent, several chapters dealing away with all kinds of limits of empiricism, and so you go, as I mentioned. So now, how do we get out of this trap? And he says, the way we get out of this is to understand experience as the key here, not reality, not connection with things as in and of themselves, but with the perceptual nature of the human mind and human capacities. And so this is the point he'll make clear here in 52c, when he says, I must not say of that which I think in space or time, that it is in itself in space and time, independent of this thought of mine, for then I would contradict myself, since space and time, together with the appearances in them, are nothing existing in themselves and outside my representation, but are themselves only ways of representing. And it is patently contradictory to say of a mere way of representing that it also exists outside of our representation. So, space and time is a category of representation that we experience. And to think that a category as such exists in reality is, of course, ridiculous. It's like saying the category of beauty exists somewhere in reality. It's not. These kinds of things are not the kinds of things that we even should think exist in reality. But notice he's getting rid of space and time. Having gotten rid of us as existing, he now moves on to let's get rid of space and time. So, I mean, he's just offhandedly throwing out these major categories. Yeah, we like to think that space and time exist, but that's definitely a thought failure, right? This is simply an experience of a necessary representation. And so once you get this idea down, you have the core of what Kant finally ends up landing on through all this convoluted and logically powerful argumentation, which is that we experience categories of necessary senses that are built into our perceptual apparatus and not anything that has much to do with the real world. It's not to say that it has no connection, but that connection is not available to us, as we'll see over and over again as we roll out the end sections here. And you get this in the best part. I think the most powerful section of this you see is when he's talking about the question of free will and determinism. And this is about 2 pages later, 97 in mine, when he says, okay, how can you have these thesis and antithesis, everything is caused by natural laws and we have freedom, right? These must be mutually exclusive. And he says, no, they only seem mutually exclusive because we're thinking about them incorrectly. And I can now say without contradiction, all actions of rational beings, insofar as they are appearances, are encountered in some experience or other, are subject to natural necessity, but the very same actions, with respect only to the rational subject and its faculty of acting in accordance with bare reason, are free. So we're both subject to natural law and free. So, nothing more than the determinability of every event in the sensible world according to constant laws, and therefore a relation to a cause within the appearance, whereby the underlying thing in itself and its causality remain unknown. So we don't know the underlying causality. It might exist, but we don't know it. But I say the law of nature remains, whether the rational being be a cause of effects in the sensible world through reason, and hence through freedom, or whether that being does not determine such effects through rational grounds. For if it is the first case, the action takes place according to maxims whose effects within appearance will always conform to constant laws. If in the second case, and the action does not take place according to principles of reason, then it is subject to the empirical laws of sensibilities, and in both cases the effects are connected according to constant laws, but we require nothing more for natural necessity, and indeed know nothing more of it. In the first case, however, reason is the cause of these natural laws and is therefore free, meaning that our reason constructs our perception of the natural laws to be how they are. In the second case, effects flow according to mere natural laws of sensibilities, because reason determined by sensibility, which he says is impossible, and it is therefore also free in this case. Therefore, freedom does not impede the natural law of appearances any more than this law interferes with the freedom of practical use of reason, a ground that stands in connection with the things in themselves as determining grounds. In this way, practical freedom, namely the freedom in which reason has causality in accordance with objective determining grounds, is rescued without natural necessity suffering the least harm and respect to the very same effects as appearances. Wow. Okay. Can we summarize that? Sure. But this is important. So what he's saying is, look, there might be these overarching natural laws that determine every single thing about how our lives happen, and hence we're just automaton. There's no free will debate. But we don't know that. There's no way for us to know. This is one of those categories of things that we can't know. It's outside of human experience. It's outside of categorical. Now you're just doing pointless, endless metaphysical speculation. However, we do know that natural laws do appear to unite cause and effect. And one of the causes that we experience a lot is our application of free will to be a cause in affecting other things. And so it may be that our sense of cause and effect that we participate in is an outcome of our reason, in which case the whole thing is structured as a category of free things that we get to do. Or it may be that the way our reason interprets our sensibility causes us to feel that cause and effect is happening. But in either case, we still have free will, even though you can have this natural determinism, which again seems contradictory, but he says it only seems contradictory when you imagine you have access to the real, when you have access to things in themselves as they actually are. But he says we absolutely do not have this. And once you realize that, the confusion goes away. But notice, so this is his recurrent thing. Like, what can you rescue for thinking, for rationality, for philosophy, for metaphysics, when you lose access to the universe as it is, and you're left with the universe as you can perceive it with your rationality and sensibility? And again, notice he starts this whole section off with saying, and one thing we know is pure reason doesn't help here, is because pure reason can create, obviously, arguments that are both independently perfect but are absolutely contradictory. And so we know that that's not even, like he says, it's not even just wrong, it's not even thinking at that point. It's so misleading that it's just a type of mental delusion. And so then he turns to where we've been kind of wandering the entire time. So this question of, this is in 55, is there such a thing as a supremely perfect first being, right? God, right? Now we're on to the theistic question, right? Or is there a God? Can we say this? Of course, he's not going to quite say it quite so directly, but it's pretty directly, right? When you say the idea of a supremely perfect first being, to determination of the possibility, hence the reality of all other things. Of course, because if, like, this is the classic metaphysical kind of arguments that have been deployed, is like, well, grant me a God and I'll prove a lot of other stuff, right? Like, that makes it a lot easier if you'll just, for the sake of argument, give me a God that has these kinds of, sort of conditions and such, and then we can make all kinds of useful arguments. And he's like, no, he's not going to do this. Here, therefore, the dialectic illusion, which arises from our taking the subjective conditions of our thinking for the objective conditions of things themselves, and are taking a hypothesis that is necessary for the satisfaction of our reason for dogma, is easily exposed. So I think this two sentences or one sentence is always hard to tell with Kant. That's one sentence. And it actually goes on from there. But so let's do that slowly. Here, therefore, the dialectical illusion, which arises from our taking the subjective conditions of our thinking. So for us to be able to think, all these conditions happen to apply, right? This is what he's been on about. For objective conditions of things in themselves. So the fact that we have to think in space and time doesn't mean that space and time exist, doesn't mean that things out there in the world have space and time. It just means we need that to be able to think. You take categories of space and time away from us and our thinking doesn't work. And he says, but that doesn't mean it exists. We keep making this mistake. And he says, and are taking a hypothesis that is necessary for the satisfaction of our reason for dogma. Second part of this is, just because it's reasoned and logical and fulfills all of the categories necessary for our reason doesn't make it true. So, wow, like he just levels the ground, right? Like your senses, again, empiricism, give you nothing about the outside world. Your reason gives you nothing about the outside world. Clearly, this is just true. So, what are we left with? And he says this in 56. He says, therefore, the transcendental idea expresses the peculiar vocation of reason, namely to be a principle of the systematic unity of the use of understanding. Whew. So we want to use reason to think, and we need to use reason to think. But what we need to use reason for is to collate and organize and stretch across our empirical experiences, which, as we know, have absolutely nothing to do with what's going on out there in the world. And so what he really leaves us with here, and functionally, by the way, this is the conclusion of the prolegomena. Everything else is sort of, as we'll see here briefly, is sort of apologetics stretched out. Because he makes the most incredible arguments. Having done this, by the way, and to keep this in mind, so having written this entire book, which is, of course, itself like 10% of the critique of pure reason, to point out and to make the argument that the idealists are wrong and that the empiricists are wrong, and that what we have is only the capacity to reflect on the categories and conditions under which we're capable of thinking, and to interpret and express the world that we can from that as an aspect of what is necessary for us to think, not as the world is in and of itself. That he's put totally beyond our realm. And so this puts really strict boundaries on both what empiricism and idealism can achieve, and also, of course, it's going to limit the grounds of metaphysics, which theoretically he is regrounding and refounding and making new and fresh. But what, in fact, he's doing is just cutting his legs off, right? You can almost do no metaphysical thinking here, which we'll see in a moment. And so having taken away all the grounds for which we might get beyond any but the most sort of okay, we have empirical experiences, we can reason with them, but this is always going to be highly limited, and primarily what we're thinking about is how we relate to the things in themselves, but to which we never have real access. We can run tests on that, we can make extensions from that, but we can't really rely on that so much. And he said, so having argued this pretty clearly and made this pretty profound assault on our two main ways of thinking about these things, He says, it is true, this is in section 57, it is true we cannot provide beyond all possible experience any determinate concept of what things in themselves may be. But we are nevertheless not free to hold back entirely in the face of inquiries about things, for experience never fully satisfies reason. It directs us ever further back in answering questions and leaves unsatisfied as regard their full elucidation, as everyone can sufficiently observe in the dialectics of pure reason, which for this very reason has its good subjective ground. Who can bear being brought, as regard the nature of our soul, both to the point of a clear consciousness of the subject and to the conviction that the appearances of that subject cannot be explained materialistically, without asking what then the soul really is, and, if no concept of experience suffices, without perchance adopting a concept of reason, that of simple immaterial being, just for this purpose, although we can by no means prove the objective reality of that concept, who can satisfy themselves with the mere cognition through experience in all the cosmological questions of the duration and size of the world, the freedom of natural necessity, since wherever we may begin, any answer given according to principles of experience always begets new questions, which also requires an answer, and for that reason clearly proves the insufficiency of all physical modes of explanation for satisfaction of reason. Finally, who cannot see, from the thoroughgoing contingency and dependency of everything, that they might think of assuming according to principles of experience the impossibility of stopping with these, and who does not feel compelled, regardless of all prohibitions against losing oneself in transcendental ideas, nevertheless to look for peace and satisfaction beyond all concepts that one can justify through experience in the concept of a being, the idea of which itself cannot in itself be understood as regards to possibility, an idea without which, however, reason was always have remained unsatisfied. So there's a long passage, but what he's saying here is, right, I know I just said you can't have this. I know it's clear. He just repeats basically his core argument here. Look, it's beyond your category of understanding. You can never really experience. You're just creating stuff ad hoc as you move along because you can keep always answering questions in these infinite regresses. But who finds this satisfactory? No one finds this satisfactory. So it cannot be refuted either because it pertains to a mere being of the understanding, an idea without which, however, reason would always have remained unsatisfied. So there is a desire in reason. Like it is the nature of reason to have this desire to have these absolute supreme beings, bound souls, all these kinds of questions answered. Therefore, this idea of the transcendent is there. So it doesn't mean we can't have these transcendent questions. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to answer them. It just means that we shouldn't pretend like the answers are meaningful. I mean, I know that it sounds hard to believe, but this is what he ends up arguing, right? And this is why everyone's like, is he really an atheist? Does he really believe this? Because it's such special pleading, right? Having been so careful all the way up now, he's like, well, hey, what do these boundaries mean? This is why he talks about boundaries, the limits of our actually thinking. And he goes on in this vein. This is the last couple of pages of the third section, where he really lapses into this special pleading section. And if for some reason you should decide to read the Critique of Pure Reason, he does this at like regular, I don't know how regular, but it feels like every 10 or 15 pages he stops and says, oh, but of course this doesn't mean, that God doesn't exist or that we don't have a soul. Because, obviously, sure, I mean, these arguments don't mean anything about that. Even though he's just spent 10 pages absolutely refuting that. It's the same thing here. Well, sure, every argument I've made says that you can't do that, but reason won't be satisfied with that. So what should we do, right? Like reason, so just feel free to go ahead, right? Just, go off on that metaphysical tangent that I've just been saying we absolutely shouldn't do for the entirety of this work, because otherwise reason will be unsatisfied. And so he has this, and I'll stop with this passage on this subject because he does go on and on. He says, this is 106 in my book. This is still, I think, are we in the still same section? Yeah, it's a long section here. It's a clue that he doesn't know what he's doing. 57. Yeah, there's all 57. And he says, we should then think for ourselves of an immaterial being, an intelligible world, and a highest of all beings, all noumena, because only in these things, as things in themselves, does reason find completion and satisfaction, which it can never hope to find in the derivation of the appearances from the homogeneous grounds of those appearances. And we should think such things for ourselves because the appearances actually do relate to something distinct from them, and so entirely heterogeneous, in that appearances always presuppose a thing in itself, and so provide notice of such a thing, whether or not can be cognized more closely. So, hey, reason wants this, and we can kind of get a sense of this, so just go for it, right? Like basically he's like, let's just go for it. And then, in the next paragraph, of course, on the one hand Kant giveth, on the one hand Kant taketh away. Now, since we can, however, never cognize these intelligible beings according to what they may be in themselves, determinedly, though we must nonetheless assume such beings in relation to the sensible world and connect them with it through reason, we can still at least think this connection by means of such concepts as we express the relation of those beings to the sensible world. Whew. So, once again, hey, so just go ahead and make this up. But remember when you make this up that you're actually not talking about anything that has anything to do with the real world, quote unquote, as it might exist. But it could be that they have, we could think about them in terms of how we connect them to our ideas of the real world, right? So it's such this one step forward, two steps back. So you create an imaginary friend and imagine that imaginary friend really does exist. But by existence, it means not that it exists in the real world in any real sense, but it exists in the sense that your need for a friend creates a connection to a concept of an imaginary friend. And if you think about the creation of the concept of an idea of an imaginary friend, that's practically like having an imaginary friend, which is almost like having an imaginary friend that really might exist in a world to which you have no sensible access. So, practically there, right? Like we're good. This satisfies no religious thinkers of any kind, way, shape, or form. And he concludes this section here of 57. He says, he uses the classic example that all the people that argue for the creation theory of the universe and of the world and of people use. And so I think it was good to knock off there with this. If I say that we are compelled to look upon the world as if it were the work of a supreme understanding and will, I actually say nothing more than, in the way that a watch, a ship, and a regiment are related to an artisan, a builder, and a commander, the sensible world, or everything that makes up the basis of the sum total of appearance, is related to the unknown, which I do not thereby cognize according to what it is in itself, but only in according to what it is for me, that is, with respect to the world of which I'm a part. And so this is the classic watchmaker, right? You look at the world and you go, this must have a creator, because just as we look at a watch, we think there was a watchmaker. When we look at the world, we say, oh, just as there is a world, there must have been a world maker. Like, this just seems reasonable. And Kant says, absolutely, that's reasonable, as long as I do not think that I have any knowledge about the watchmaker, right? I cannot look at a watch in isolation and determine what kind of coffee the watchmaker liked to drink, right? Like I don't get that. I don't know where they lived. I don't know what they looked like. I don't know if they lost a finger in a biking accident. I don't know anything. Right? The watch doesn't tell me anything. And in fact, I'm only cognizing the theory of the watchmaker because that's the way my mind is structured. So go ahead and cognize that way. You may as well, because you look around the world and it seems as if it's the kind of world that might have been made by somebody, but that doesn't give us access to any knowledge about that being, and it doesn't actually provide any evidence that that being exists. It just provides us with a category of thought that is fulfilling our reason when we're faced with these kinds of problems. And so when people use this watchmaker, again, once you read Kant, he kind of poisons you against all kinds, well, in a good way, I guess. He kind of defends you against all kinds of metaphysical nonsense, including this incredibly common watchmaker argument, in which Kant actually says, yes, go ahead and believe that. But just remember that you don't know anything, right? So this is not what people want. They want to say, oh, the universe was made by a God. Kant's like, great, you can believe that. Therefore, and Kant's like, oh, no, there are no therefores, right? Like, you don't get any therefores because you don't know anything about that God. It's not a thing that you get to know about. You're probably only thinking this because of the structure of your mind. That's all you get. And everybody else wants to go, oh, but therefore, sins and resurrections and souls. He's like, no. That's what you can cognize is you have a watch. Therefore, you conclude, because of the way your mind is structured, that there was a watchmaker. Fair enough. That fulfills reason. Like, you want to believe that. Why not go ahead and believe that? You can't disprove it. You can't prove it either. But there's no declining knowledge from that. Everything that you try to do from that is simply is specious, according to Kant, along with everything else, right? Like, everything else becomes specious with Kant. So that is the sum of the core of his argument. We'll have a concluding section on what this all means in application and through time over the last couple hundred years. But you can see he achieves several things, so several powerful things. One, he basically rips all metaphysics out of the ground. And so he says that it's a prolegomena to any future metaphysics to which you can read as, well, your metaphysics now don't work. Two, he really, really undercuts both idealism and empiricism, which are even today two of the most powerful schools of thinking in practice, which Kant himself says is fine, right? Like, he says, they don't need mathematics and science to give them the two categories he uses, although that's not necessarily the correct way to think about this, but a good way, reasonable way. They don't need his sort of metaphysical grounding, as long as they don't claim to do anything more than say, hey, I ran an experiment and these were the results, and this seems to be something that implies these other things over here. As long as they're not claiming any sort of truth or transcendent insight or incredible power, then they're fine. But of course, we want to do that the next second, right? That's what we love to do. We want to make that metaphysical leap. Mathematics, we want to make that metaphysical leap. And in both empiricism and idealism, Kant is saying, no, you do not have the grounds to do that. The only way you have the grounds to do that is with metaphysics. And I've just completely rebounded the field of metaphysics to be an exploration of what the structure of human thinking and cognition and experience is. And that is what metaphysics can explore. It can't explore anything else. It is the subject of the exploration, is our capacities and our interface with a virtually unknowable world. That's how he tries to reground that. And in so doing, he just pisses off everybody, right? Kant attacks like every major, he undercuts. It's not a lot of thinkers that undercut religion and science at the same time, right? He's like, oh, they're both like they've both gone off the rails. They're making claims they absolutely cannot support, and they need to stop doing that, while being very pro-religion and science, right? This is a thing that's so hard to get your mind around with him. Is he's pro-science, he's pro-religion, he's pro-mathematics. And yet he just cuts their. He's like, yeah, they're great, but they can't do what they say they're doing. They've got to stop that. Like, this misleads them. This creates problems. This creates thinking and logical errors that keep befuddling us as we move forward in time. So, wrap this section up here for today. But I do want to note that what this leads to, and Kant was perfectly aware of this, as hence his categorical imperative and such things like this, is really quite profound, and its interpretation, application, and extension has laid a very different kind of ethical framework for how to think about the world philosophically that, again, it's been hugely influential and is still being argued about today. And that will be our concluding section. Thank you very much.